Well, good afternoon, everyone. We wanted to wait a few moments, so we have this bright sunny weather, and we thought people would come in from playing Frisbee, but I guess that's not going to be the case today. But I do want to thank all of you who've braved the snowstorm. I was in Antarctica 2 weeks ago, and I can tell you the weather is worse here than in the Antarctic. I mean, this is really getting to be something. This event today is a real favorite of ours at the Dickey Center because it really marks the celebration of the scholarship of a Dartmouth student over the course of, in this case, her senior year. This award, the Chase Peace Prize, was made possible through a bequest by Mr. Edward Chase, a Lithuanian native and a New Hampshire businessman, if I recall, in the furniture business, who translated his success into philanthropy. He was very concerned about the propensity of human societies to go to war and the suffering that was created through it. And he made bequests to Dartmouth, Harvard, and other schools through which he sought to encourage careful reflection on the causes of war and the prospects for peace. And he wanted this research to be done by students who he felt were poised to make a real difference in the coming generations. Now, today's Peace Prize presentation may seem a little bit off the beaten track, both literally and figuratively. The research conducted by Katie Blumenthal, the class of 2006, as you can see from up here, took place in a remote part of northern India. And it focuses not on militaries, on militias, weapons deployment, weapons of nuclear mass destruction, or conflict even in a conventional sense, but on music. Now, music, you might ask, what has that to do with peace and war? Well, it is in fact the social role of musicians in a society rent by religious, cultural, and caste divisions that lies at the heart of Katie's thesis, and which reminds us that the roots of conflict are very deep and complex. At the same time, Katie's thesis suggests that the forces that can overcome conflict may come from often surprising places. I won't steal the thunder from her presentation, but I will only emphasize that her thesis was selected from a very competitive pool because of the quality of her research, her sensitivity as a researcher, and the resonance of her findings to the subject of human conflict. I'd now like to introduce Professor Ted Levin, professor of music here at Dartmouth, who served as Katie's thesis advisor and who will introduce today's panel. Ted?
Thanks, Ken, very much. Ambassador Yalowitz has said a few words about Katie already, to which I'd like to just add a few of my own. Which, first of all, to say that it was actually a project that took more than a year. Its culmination in the actual writing was conducted during Katie's senior year, but this was actually the result of at least, 2.5 years of making 2 separate trips to the subcontinent. The first time Katie went to both Sikkim and Ladakh and actually had a different idea the first time around about what to work on. And it's also, I think, her topic and the part of the world she went to was felicitous and not at all by accident, in that she's, in addition to being a terrific ethnographer and photographer and writer, as you'll see, she's also a very skilled rock climber and loves mountains and cold weather and high altitudes. So the Himalayas were a logical place for her to head. And we really couldn't keep her away after being in Sikkim on an internship program with a medical NGO. She then came back and we talked quite a bit about how to set up a research project, and she put together a strong proposal and got funded by both the Dean of Faculty Research Grants, Office of the Dean of Faculty Research Grants, and by the Leibowitz Award out of the Hopkins Center. So this is also testimony to Dartmouth's ability to fund undergraduates who come with a really strong idea and with good qualifications to go out. That having been said, of course, it wasn't easy, and she spent from July to just around the beginning of December on her second trip, the one that focused on Ladakh. And during this time, we kept in pretty regular communication thanks to the internet. And I was the first to hear of some of these hair-raising stories of trips up to the borderlands of India and China. But this was actually a project that combined, on the one hand, first-rate ethnography, going out, and she was able to learn enough Ladakhi to be able to conduct interviews with the help of translators, but basically getting a working knowledge of the language and going out and putting up with all of the conditions that you have to put up with to do ethnography, not just put up with, but flourishing in them, and developing close relations with people in the community, and coming back every night and writing about this and putting together, kind of making a working hypothesis that was then brought back here and subjected to rigorous analysis and sort of talking through and trying to write it out and make it make sense and hold together. And after a lot of work, a lot of hard work, and many revisions to the thesis, the product emerged that was awarded this prize. And I want to add my personal word of both thanks and I think delight at the results, at the decision of the Chase Peace Prize Committee to award the prize to a thesis in music. As Ambassador Yalowitz pointed out, it's not an obvious discipline in which to award a prize, but when you think about it, it makes complete sense. And Katie expressed this relation in an email that she sent, I think, to a lot of you who are here, in which she talked about cultural premises that serve as springboards to political tensions. So if you work backwards from the political tensions and look at the cultural premises and how one can influence those cultural premises, and perhaps before they get to the stage of political tensions, how you can interrogate those and perhaps get people to think differently about cultural relationships, then you're really on to something in terms of thinking about war and peace. So I think it's actually a wonderful mark of distinction, both for Katie's work and also for the Peace Prize Committee, that they had the wisdom and the insight into this work to understand what the relationship was to issues of war and peace. Now, just moving on quickly, I'd like to introduce the panelists, starting from my right, Professor Lorraine Sakata. And I'll speak informally about Lorraine because she's been a friend and a colleague for almost 3 decades. I think we stood together on the beach in northern Poland in 1981 as founding members of the Society of Central Asian Music. That was before most people knew where Central Asia was. But Lorraine was actually ahead of me in the vanguard of scholars from the United States who went to Central Asia, in her case Afghanistan, at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 70s, when a lot of Americans were heading out that way, not to do research, but of course, to do what? Get good weed and see the wonders of the East. But some people went out to do serious ethnography, and Lorraine was one of those. She made a number of trips to Afghanistan over those years, did also very hard field work in very, very demanding physical conditions, very, very rigorous, and produced a first-rate book, which has become one of the kind of Bibles of ethnomusicology, Music in the Mind, the concepts of music and musician in Afghanistan. And if you go to see The Kite Runner, the film that's in town, you'll see her name mentioned in the thanks. She stayed in touch with Afghan communities over the years. She's been active in trying to help Afghan musicians in the conditions of war. And she's now involved. She actually moved from her longtime position at University of Washington to UCLA to become a dean. She was retired from that position 2 years ago and is now involved in a project to help digitize the music archives of Radio Kabul. So this is very important work being done, and another really exemplary career of over a lifetime, a commitment to a place and a people and a musical tradition. So we're delighted to have her here, and she's here because part of Katie's work, the idea of musician castes or musician as a caste, had a lot of analogies with work that Lorraine had done in Afghanistan with Hazara musicians. And I had suggested to Katie to read this book and other works of Lorraine, and she got in touch, and so that's culminated in Lorraine being here today. So thank you for coming. Now, Martijn van Beek, I have not met before, but I did due diligence on his CV, which is extremely extensive, and on his publications. But I'll just read, in this case, a very short description about his work and activities, and I thank Sienna Craig for providing this information. They've been colleagues a long time, but my work is in a little bit of a different part of Central Asia. Over the course of more than 20 years of engagement in Ladakh, Martijn van Beek has done truly groundbreaking work on the history of Muslim-Buddhist conflict in the region, work which illustrates the ways that Buddhism is wielded as a political tool within the larger context of Hindu-Muslim antagonisms in India, particularly Kashmir, and within the specific politics of Ladakh as a place that has been formed and influenced both by Tibet and by South Asia over the centuries. His work on development and social change, emerging from his early work on ancient futures with Helena Norberg Hodge, and then his subsequent critiques of her approach to representing cultural change, is also important in that he is able to show, through both ethnography and archival research, that questions about how and under what circumstances Ladakhis should preserve their culture and also develop date back to events in the 1920s and 30s. This contribution is important in debunking the widely held myth that modernization and attendant issues of culture loss did not emerge in Ladakh until the 1970s, and that it was linked to the arrival of Western tourists in the region. More recently, Martijn has been involved in new projects that address the relationship between neuroscience and Buddhist meditation. Currently, he is part of a collaborative, multidisciplinary project in Denmark that is attempting to understand the effects of specific Tibetan Buddhist meditation practices on the brain and brainstem. So welcome to Dartmouth and Hanover. Now, I think the procedure is that Katie goes first. Is that correct? Okay, so Katie, you've got the floor.
Sure. I really want to thank the Dickey Center, to Ambassador Yowitz, to Chris Wolfworth, and the whole Chase panel. It's really an honor to be here. I'm so happy that Professor Sakata and Professor van Beek could make it, and for Professor Levin for being part of this event. So as Professor Levin and Ambassador Yelowitz said, my thesis research focused on two groups of musicians in Ladakh, India, the Mon and the Beta. And these musicians were incorporated into Ladakhi Buddhist tradition, and their music is offered to the deities and spirits of the Buddhist cosmology, as well as used as a form of entertainment that's accompanied by Ladakhi music and dance for festivals and celebrations. But today I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective on my thesis. I want to talk about the identity of the Ladakhi Beta musicians at different levels within Ladakhi culture, and inspired by an article that I read by Professor van Beek that was published in a 2000 issue of Cultural Anthropology, I want to explore the expectations of identity and the expectations of cultural practices and how they serve as premises for social tensions in Ladakh. So for a little bit of background, and to do the last first, I don't want to forget that. Thank you. Ladakh is in the Indian state Jammu and Kashmir. It's the northeastern corner of Jammu and Kashmir. And it's 45,000 square kilometers, which is roughly the size of England. According to a 2001 census, the population was 200,000 people, although it's sure to have grown a lot since then. And the culture in Ladakh is very similar to that of Tibetan culture. It's called Little Tibet or Western Tibet in a lot of the literature. But Ladakh is at the crossroads of the Himalaya and the Karakoram Mountains. The capital city, Leh, is at 3,500 meters, which is almost 12,000 feet. But even so, it's never really been isolated. It was part of mercantile trade routes. They traded pashmina and salt that were part of the Silk Road trade route and network. So that brings a lot of cultural diversity and religious diversity into Ladakhi culture. Ladakh is separated into two districts. The eastern part is Leh and the western part is Kargil, named after their respective capitals. And today I'm going to be focusing on the context of my talk is in Leh, the eastern part of Ladakh, which is predominantly Buddhist. So let's start with a little bit of history. In the 1500s, Ladakh had its second Buddhist monarchy, the Namgyal dynasty. And it was going in full swing. The Buddhism was really strong. And they had constant border tensions with Baltistan, which is the region that's now in northern Pakistan. The Balti lords were forsaking Tibetan Buddhism and embracing Islam, which, of course, butted heads with the Namgyal dynasty. So the wars over the century ended up in not only a lot of violence, but a lot of cultural exchange. One of the Ladakhi kings ended up being captured by Balti lords, imprisoned in Baltistan, where over the winter, while he was waiting to either be killed or exiled again from Baltistan, he started to have an affair with a Balti princess. He impregnated her, and on the condition that he would embrace her as his only wife, Jammu Namgyal, the Ladakhi king, took her back to Ladakh with an entourage of musicians and servants who were all Muslims, and it must have been the intent to spread Islam through these bridal wealth servants. And that wasn't what happened when they reached Ladakh. The Ladakhis interpreted Gel Khatun, the Balti princess, as the reincarnate of White Tara, a Buddhist deity, and incorporated the musicians into Buddhist folk culture. And they played offerings to both the king and to high Rinpoches and lamas, and also started to play a form of music called Larna, which is a folk offering to Buddhist deities. So later in the mid-1800s, Ladakh was conquered by Kashmiri forces and made a part of Kashmir. The Kashmiris were Muslim, and Ladakhis were in the eastern district of Ladakh were resentful that they were underrepresented as Buddhists, and that the state of Kashmir was run all by Muslims. And this is a tension that carries through the modern history of Ladakh. And it also ties into the identity of the musicians. They were renamed the Beta musicians, which is a word of Sanskrit origin, and the Indic influence on that can't be ignored. The word means nothing in Sanskrit, and so these Muslim invaders into Ladakh had an influence, kind of a reverse influence on these musicians, since the Ladakhi Buddhists were kind of reacting to this Muslim dominance by trying to strengthen the Buddhist social hierarchy in the eastern region of Ladakh by dominating the Muslims in Ladakh. So they really embraced this role of a higher social status as Buddhists, as Ladakhi Buddhists, and looked upon these musicians as lower classes in Ladakh, as part of a rebellion to the Muslim dominance of the Kashmiri regime. And the ethnic and ancestral identity of the Betas is really inseparable from the politics because of their religion. These Betas are Muslim from Baltistan, as I said before, and so Ladakh, the tensions in Ladakh were really led by the changing religious regimes throughout history. And there's this continued theme of competition and conflict between Ladakhi Muslims and Ladakhi Buddhists. The threat was really felt by the Buddhists in the 1930s when they created the Buddhist Youth Organization and the Ladakhi Buddhist Association, who tried to have increased representation. This culminated in 1989 when there was a series of riots called that researchers call the agitation in Ladakh, and it was really a conflict between the Ladakhi Muslims and Buddhists, and caused the implementation of a local Ladakhi government or body of representatives called the Ladakh Autonomous Hill Development Council, which was modeled off of hill councils to represent different people of tribal statuses in India. So under the government of Jammu and Kashmir, the Ladakhis, as I said, were really holding on to their culture, and the Ladakh Buddhist Association really had a rigidity in their conceptualization of the identity of some of these Muslim groups. And that's clearly defined through the position of these Beta musicians. The Karman musicians, who were the palace musicians, who were originally looked at with some sort of respect, with definitely a heritage that was looked at as a specialization, an occupational specialization, were really degraded to musicians who served a function within the society. And so they were subjected to comprise this subservient caste, which was really reflected in their hereditary occupation, their difference in religion, their segregated living communities. They couldn't intermarry with other communities in Ladakh. And the concept of their impurity and untouchability is really a tangible force in Ladakh. There is an elaborate etiquette of approaches to this untouchability and purity practices that the musicians have to undergo. So part of the cultural dominant scheme of incorporating a hierarchical system was, as it was in response also to the burgeoning population of immigrants into Ladakh. Not only had the Beta musicians arrived in the 1500s and were still 300 years later looked at as a subservient caste and as outsiders, and there were other musicians who came from Himachal Pradesh, which is south of Ladakh. And they were dubbed the Mon musicians and joined the ranks of other non-Tibetan people in Ladakh who were also ostracized from the Ladakhi Buddhist community. In modern Ladakh, these families of Mons are settled throughout different villages, and they're even chronicled in Ladakhi history, in folk songs, and their role in the society is chronicled through this oral tradition. And this idea of social hierarchy, which seems to contradict the precepts of Buddhism and Islam and their cultural practices, is actually fairly common in Central Asia and in the Himalaya. Certain musicians, groups of musicians in Afghanistan that Professor Sakata discusses in Music in the Mind have a stigma attached to their hereditary occupation. And there are peripheralized communities of immigrants called Monpa, seen throughout Nepal and northern India. The vassal serf, the feudal system, was a classical Tibetan hierarchical system that functioned in similar ways to this de facto caste of musicians in Ladakh. And of course, there was the influence of the Hindu caste system, which was not so far south in Ladakh, in Himachal Pradesh, and also in parts of Kashmir. So it makes sense that the Ladakhis would respond to those of non-Ladakhi identity, those who embody some sort of otherness, with oppressing them in their social sphere. And it makes sense also that feeling religiously threatened by the government, they would support identities that degraded these Muslim musicians. And this was only enhanced by the visual reinforcement that these musicians were performing their music in most cultural events. The musicians from and the instruments themselves embody a stigma where Ladakhis can't touch them and they can't play them, otherwise they'd be contaminated themselves by the impurities that that the musicians have themselves. And the music is what really bound the Beta caste into this social system by the fact that it was such a strong visual, both with their instruments and with their performance practices. And the visual identity is really inescapable. To have people constantly performing music in such a conspicuous role, that constant reinforcement really left a legacy among the Ladakhis. So it's in sharp contrast with monastic instruments that are played in Ladakh. The gyaling on the upper left is the most similar instrument to the surna because it's shanai, or it's an oboe type of horn that's played with a double reed, but you rarely see surna that are decorated with fine jewels, and you rarely see them with ceremonial scarves wrapped around them or people praying around them. And of course, the monastic body would never perform on the folk instruments. Here's just an example also of the context in which musicians would be playing in a monastery. It's drastically different from the monastic band who's being served tea the whole time and sitting on comfortable monastery runners and carpets. And the visuals are really quite stunning, to the point where most visitors to Ladakh don't even notice these musicians, despite their importance and their role being there. And while practicing, the musicians were constantly degraded. So the religious context is not the only context in which they perform. They also perform for festivities and for as entertainment. And there are endless stories, like Ted said, that of musicians being beaten by wedding parties because of their rank, or because they had played too long and were tired. Or they wouldn't play long enough. There's stories of musicians being forced to play until they vomited blood, getting permanent health problems from their performance practice. And this is just one example. Abdul Ali is the father of the most prominent Ladakhi musician, who actually had that happen to him playing in a monastery. And was never able to play again. It took away his livelihood, and he remained living in this farmhouse that you see here, but he really depends on his community and community donations for food and other staples, because he has no other way of getting income. There were the boycotts that I talked about, the agitation in 1989 extended. It really hit the Muslim musician community hard. There were multiple house burnings. People had to flee their villages and seek refuge with predominantly Muslim communities. And so it's stripping them of their livelihoods, this ostracization, and also their identity, because besides the music, they were merely untouchables and really had no place in society. And it's interesting what how modernization is playing a role in this concept of identity, because betas are learning that they don't have to be subjected to this inferior status. They're learning they're learning about social and political history in India especially, and that they can kind of escape their identity by the increasing economy in Ladakh, the increasing population. They can leave their villages and go into different areas, different occupations, and it's quite common for ex-musicians to be in the army or to leave to the capital city where no one knows them and somehow try to make a new life for themselves. And I met with a lot of these musicians who are or ex-musicians who are very quiet about their past, and confided in me that their past was really tense. In many cases, their villages had completely boycotted the musicians and wouldn't interact with them and basically stifled them. So there was no other option for these people. Other musicians are approaching it differently. Some are joining completely Muslim societies or enclaves and don't interact with Ladakhi Buddhists. And this you see on the outskirts of Leh, the capital city. But there's some who are trying to embrace their past. They see the value of culture, and Ladakhis have this fear of losing their culture. So they see that there's an economic market for it, both through tourism and through making recordings. And they also see that there's this cultural value. And there are a few musicians in particular who have gotten jobs with the government, performing music for the radio station, and who have tried to organize unions to advance the status of their fellow musicians. But it's really quite hard for them because it's only a few of them trying to initiate these unions, and they have little support. Since, as I mentioned before, the musicians now are both Buddhist and Muslim, there's also a tension between the musicians. They have different interests. So with most of the Beta musicians quitting music as their occupation, and the Ladakis really trying to hold on to their culture, there are two other groups of musicians who are stepping in, and one's the Mon musicians, who are also degraded low caste, untouchable caste, who learn their music from the Beta musicians. And a lot of the Beta musicians see a problem with this because there's a loss of the traditional culture, a loss of the repertoire that was developed over hundreds of years. And there's also a new group of Ladakis who are kind of realizing that it's not actually the music, it's not the instruments that are creating this stigma, and that their culture is so important that they take up these instruments and try to play them. They realize that Ladakhi culture really depends on the performance practice on these particular instruments. And they're termed lakchespa, which is a euphemism for artisan, and the community is very strongly embrace this term, trying to show a shift, a paradigm shift. Ironically, still with this, embracing this identity of the former Beta musicians as an untouchable caste. So it's a really interesting modernization brings in a really interesting proposition to the identity of these musicians, and I'll leave it at the question of how culture can be preserved while accommodating the inevitable evolution and fluidity of identity.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Katie. And we're now going to have the first commentary on the thesis by Professor Lorraine Sakata, and you'll talk for about 15 minutes. Is that right?
5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
I'll leave time for discussion because I think that's the interesting part. But first of all, I'd like to thank Katie and the Dickey Center for inviting me here today. It's really wonderful that I can participate and get to know you. And I'm talking about musicians of low social status, music of high cultural significance. The conundrum of low-status musicians providing music of high cultural significance is found throughout the wide sweep of Islamic cultures, from North Africa and Eastern Europe, through the Middle East, all the way to West, Central, and South Asia, and even to parts of East and Southeast Asia. Therefore, one would think that this phenomenon is somehow linked to Islam. Yet Katie Blumenthal has discovered this same conundrum in Ladakh, a principally Buddhist society. The Mon and Beta musicians, on whom her study is based, provide performances of Larna in the context of Tibetan Buddhism. The principal instruments of the Mon and Beta are the surna, which you saw, a conical bore double reed instrument or sham, and daman, a pair of kettle drums played with sticks. These instruments are generally considered to be outdoor instruments with specialized repertoire for ceremonial and ritual events, often associated with the official court or state events. They also accompany military parades, sporting events, weddings, and other festivities. The Sorna type instrument, also known as shanai in India, zurna in Turkey, is a constant partner of the pipe and drum combination. While the drum can be represented by a single double-headed drum played with sticks known as dang in Baltistan, dhol in India, Afghanistan, and Iran, and davul in Turkey, or by a pair of kettle drums known as nakara in India, Iran, and the Middle East, and daman in Baltistan and Ladakh. In Baltistan, the outdoor ensemble includes all three types of instruments. The musicians who specialize in playing these instruments are invariably hereditary, professional musicians who occupy a low status in the social hierarchy. As the names Mon and Beda imply, these Sorna and Daman musicians are considered outsiders or non-Tibetans who migrated to Ladakh from Himachal Pradesh and Baltistan. The Sorna and Dhol musicians I encountered during my research in Afghanistan were also considered outsiders, belonging to an ethnic occupational group of gypsy-like barber musicians known as Jats or Dalaks, who were suspected of being non-Muslims. The Mon and Beda, the Mon in Baltistan, they were called Mon, they were not called Beda. The Mon in Baltistan are considered an endogamous group of professional hereditary musicians. Prior to 1972, when the princely states were abolished, they were supported by the Rajas, whom they served. They provided music to mark all ceremonial official events in which Rajas participated, including the coronation of Rajas, the registration of genealogies, the offering of praises to Rajas and important guests, greetings of official visitors, and sporting events. Sporting events such as polo, archery, and hunting necessitated the participation of musicians whose present repertoire includes a significant amount of music used on these occasions. In return for their services, the Mon were clothed, fed, and given lands to work. Inheritance among the Rajas included Mon musicians, as well as other property. Thus, the Raja-Mon relationship was formalized into a patron-client relationship. Rajas often provided musical instruments and musical training to their Mon. A former Raja related the story of a Makpon Raja who visited the court of Akbar, where he learned a great deal about music. So upon return, he taught his own Mon what he had learned. After the abolishment of the princely states in 1972, the number of Mon musicians dwindled. Of the 15 Mon families in Khapalu in 1989, only 5 remained as practicing musicians. Others found jobs in government service, the army, or in farming. 3 of the Mon musicians from Khapalu served as the Skardu police band, playing Sorna, Daman, and Dang. The Baltis lamented the passing of the Raja system, which meant the passing of traditional Balti music. They acknowledged the loss of their great song repertoire, saying only 200 Balti songs are still remembered in outlying villages. But this is only a fraction of what the repertoire used to be. In this respect, Katie's central point of her thesis that, and I quote, social change typically comes at a cost to tradition, has already been played out by the Mon in Baltistan. The case of the Mon in Baltistan suggests that religion did not play a significant part in their identity because they served a primarily Muslim community. However, religion became an important identifier and distinction for the musicians who went to Ladakh to serve Buddhist patrons. The hereditary professional barber musicians of Afghanistan, known as Dalak, were treated as pariahs, facing harsh discrimination in the society they served. Although the question of caste was raised in studies of low-status hereditary musicians in this part of the world, few scholars directly confronted the place of caste in a non-Hindu society, especially in a predominantly Buddhist or Muslim society. Friedrich Barth was one of the few in his study of the social stratification in Swat, northern Pakistan. He called these hierarchically ordered groups, he called them castes. He identified barbers as a polluted caste who dealt with haircutting, shaving, nail paring, and childbirth, but who were also important in, and I quote, the organization of celebrations, the announcement of the event to appropriate outsiders, and the mobilization of the assistance from fellow association members to which each family is entitled. I should mention here that barbers in Afghanistan performed circumcisions, ritually required for all Muslim males. Barth contends that the low taboo status of these barbers stems from their, quote, intimate contact with the domestic life of each family in breach of the usual barriers of prudery and seclusion. And he continues, the barber's status needs to be clearly segregated from that of other persons in the community. Both Katie's work and my own suggest that there is ample evidence to associate these musician groups with low castes or even outcasts of Hindu India. But Katie had the forthrightness to identify these groups as castes, and I did not. Like many such musicians in Ladakh, Afghan Dalaks have reacted to modernization in urban areas by finding opportunities to mask their Dalak identity, by assuming religious titles such as Haji or Sufi, and by specializing in an occupation that serves an urban population, for example, by operating a Western-style barbershop in town. A more difficult avenue to respectability is dependent on one's artistic superiority, such as the one enjoyed by Ali Muhammad in Ladakh. He's financially comfortable, holds a government post at All India Radio, and is treated with respect. Katie's model ethnography on the social dynamics of Mon and Beda musicians of Ladakh points to the problems faced by many traditional musicians in contemporary society, where changes in economy, politics, and globalization have challenged the traditional standing of professional musicians in society. Today, tourism, international interest in world music, and global networks have catapulted the exceptional traditional musicians such as Bismillah Khan, who's a Shehnai player of India, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, Qawwali singer of Pakistan, and Zakir Hussain, tabla master of India, onto the world stage and have encouraged non-hereditary musicians such as Ali Muhammad's students to pursue a music career with less stigma attached to their profession than to their teachers. On the other hand, as Katie mentioned, these students lack the traditional learning environment promoted by a family of musicians who pass on their most valuable repertoire to their sons as inheritance. Are ceremonial and ritual music losing their significance in today's society? Are we losing repertoire associated with these culturally significant events? And what does the future hold for the traditional hereditary musicians like the Mon and Beda in the globally connected world of ours? And I hope we can answer some of these questions and related questions in our panel discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine, very much. That was terrific, very clear. Martijn.
Thanks. I also want to thank the Dickey Center for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to come out here and get some snow. I know Americans think that Denmark is like Norway with lots of snow, but this winter we've hardly seen any. So it's a real pleasure with this weather, because it really is a change from the dreary drizzle that we've had for a couple of months now. I also really want to thank Katie for doing this project and writing this thesis, because it's a really important topic. It hasn't been researched much at all, and it's a very sensitive topic, and she's written it up in a way that is quite remarkable, I think, in the way in which she manages to negotiate what is really a very controversial issue in Ladakh. I mean, it shows that her sensitivity in the field has been quite unusual. And the complexities of Ladakhi politics, not only formal politics, but also sort of the social politics of different communities, are extremely difficult to penetrate. So I have tremendous respect, and I hope you'll keep working on Ladakh. There's not that many of us who do that. The peace studies connection, I think, the conflict, international relations and so on, connection, I think is there. My own PhD research at Cornell was funded by the United States Institute of Peace. So it's nice to have another person who's making that connection. And I think the issues you're talking about really speak to fundamental tensions in Ladakhi society. I mean, it's one example of a number of different fault lines within Ladakhi society as it's undergoing very rapid change, and which has generated a widespread sense of fear. Fear about the future of the religion, fear about the future of the culture, and which has been part of the explanation for the violence that has been characterizing community relations in Ladakh over the last decade or two. What I want to do is speak briefly about, I'm not an ethnomusicologist, I'm not going to say much about the music, although some of my friends have been interviewed by Katie. But I'll talk some more about some of the general issues of social reform and the tensions within Buddhism, attempts at reforming Buddhism, modernizing Buddhism, that are coming from within Ladakh. So rather than looking at this problem of, among other things, community relations, but also caste discrimination as something that outsiders need to confront Ladakhis with, which I think is an important part of what foreigners, or what outsiders can do. I think it is important also to recognize the internal discussions that are already taking place. And I'll try and say something about that. I'll try to say something about the kinds of, well, some of the reasons why there might be such resistance to actually doing something about these kinds of practices, because they still continue very much today. I'll begin with two examples of caste discrimination that I've encountered in my own research in Ladakh and different work I've done over the years. Back in the late 80s, I was working for something called the Ladakh Ecological Development Group, which was trying to do counter-development, as the founder, Helena Norberg-Hodge, called it. And we had a very small staff at the time. There was only about 10 people, some carpenters, and a blacksmith, engineer, and a few people working in the office. The blacksmith was trained as an engineer, had a modern education, was qualified as an engineer, was doing really good work with developing alternative technologies using solar technology, among other things. In 1988, I think, 87, in the winter of 87, 88, the project scored a largish grant from the Norwegian Aid Ministry and expanded its staff very dramatically. The next summer we came back to work in Ladakh again, and after a while we heard this story that the engineer was told no longer to eat together with the rest of the staff. The rest of the staff were refusing to eat with him. And he asked why, and they said, well, he's a blacksmith. So in addition to musicians, blacksmiths are another community that is regarded as polluting in Ladakh. Another story which I heard last summer from the leader of one of the two main interest organizations of low-caste people in Ladakh was a story of a nun, or rather a Beda girl, who from early childhood had shown a great interest in religion, in spiritual practice. And so she had applied to become a nun. She'd always wanted to do this. And found it difficult to find a nunnery. There are problems with nuns in general in Ladakh, nuns as opposed to monks. But finally she managed to get permission to join a nunnery in Temesgam in lower Ladakh, even though the nuns had initially resisted her joining because she was a Beda. But she left again after a couple of months because they made her life simply impossible. So despite the fact that the Rinpoche, the incarnate Lama who was responsible for this nunnery, had insisted that this was against Buddhism, they shouldn't discriminate against people of low caste, shouldn't exist. Even in that case, and even though this was a woman who was clearly dedicated to pursuing a religious career, even nuns refused to accept somebody like that in their midst. It's a very stark example, I think. Butchers is another example, actually, of a low-status group. And there's an interesting story here because in 1989, when this agitation happened where the Buddhist community put the entire Muslim community under a social boycott, banning all social interaction, economic transactions, and so on, they ran into a problem. The urban population of Leh is very fond of meat. In fact, when we used to go to work in villages, we always made sure we had a large supply of meat, or we tried to negotiate something with the villagers that we could get a goat and take it outside of the village limits. And we always had a Muslim working for us who could kill the goat. Now, in 1989, when this boycott happened, you couldn't go to a Muslim butcher anymore. So what did you do? Well, what they did was in no time, and literally within a week or two, they arranged Buddhist butchers. And who are the Buddhist butchers? The nomads.
Oh, yeah.
The nomads from eastern Ladakh raise yaks and sheep and goats for pashmina, and the yak for meat and wool. And they kill yaks. Usually at the beginning of the winter, they'll kill a yak. And the way they do it is quite horrific. They suffocate them. So you plug the nose and you tie the mouth shut, and then you just wait until it rolls over, which can take a very long time. So partly because of these practices of killing animals, nomads are also looked down upon. So they're a different group within Ladakh, which is not it's not considered polluting, but you don't want to marry. You don't want to have your daughter or your son marry a nomad. Now, these dark secrets, you could say, about caste discrimination are generally trying to be kept from outsiders, as Katie herself has also found out, I'm sure. She has a wonderful passage in her thesis where she realizes that the reason the family she stayed with in Ladakh was so happy that she moved out and moved into a guest house was because they knew she was working with these polluting people. So that's why. Because normally Ladakhis don't want you to leave their houses. They're really hospitable. And they wouldn't tell you straight why they want to get rid of you. But this dark secret is played down, and it hasn't been researched very much. Ladakh benefits strongly from this general, very positive image that Buddhism and Buddhist societies have in the eyes of Westerners and also in the eyes of Indians. It attracts tourists. It sells, it sells tour packages, and it attracts sympathy more generally because it allows the Ladakhi Buddhists to contrast themselves, for example, with Muslims. Ladakhi Buddhists are considered patriotic, peaceful inherently, and modernized, sort of people with a modern outlook to a large extent. Whereas Muslims, and particularly Kashmiri Muslims, are regarded as secessionist, violent, anti-modern, anti-democratic, and they treat their women badly as well. So, in this political play for autonomy and a greater say in determining development trajectories in your own region, using the positive image of Buddhists is very important. It's one of the main reasons. There's an unusual sympathy for this tiny little population among Indian policymakers. They've really had very good press, and they've managed their press very carefully. So there is no real incentive to reveal publicly these darker sides. Now, at the same time, there are discussions within Ladakh, and they have been going on for a long time, about, among other things, these particular practices of discrimination. Because, of course, also Ladakhi Buddhists know that the Buddha was explicitly teaching against these kinds of practices. And even today, if you look at other parts of India, there are still mass conversions, more again today than in recent years. It's becoming more again of untouchables, Dalits as they're called now, converting to Buddhism. Ambedkar, one of the drafters of the Indian Constitution, promoted this mass conversion to Buddhism. Buddhism had basically died out in India proper, but it has made a comeback because it is a way of escaping the caste system. Now, of course, South Asianists all know that not only among Buddhist communities but also among Muslim communities in India, you find caste and you find practices of not necessarily entire untouchability, but strong sense of pollution. And among Shias in Ladakh also, Shias in Ladakh maintain strict rules about commensality. They don't eat food cooked by outsiders of their community, which raises all sorts of interesting problems when they are recruited into the army or when you have Shia staff working for you. As long as you only have one or two people working in an organization and they're away from home, they don't pay so much attention to it. But when there are more people around, or if they're working in their own areas, they don't want to do it. Not because they themselves necessarily support these practices still, believe in them still, but what will the other people say? And you run into problems if you want to get your daughter married, or you yourself want to marry somebody from a decent family, if you are known to break these kinds of rules. Now, in the 1920s and 30s already, I think Katie also mentioned it, there emerged already a modernization movement, a political awareness-raising movement among Buddhists in Ladakh, which, among other things, targeted the eradication of social evils in the Buddhist community. And the principal social evils that were identified were excessive consumption of alcohol, which still is going strong, which is why they end up beating not only low-caste people but also each other at weddings. But the other main target of these campaigns was polyandry, the custom of several brothers marrying a single wife. And the reason for that was not only was it seen by Hindu neo-Buddhist converts as something that was beyond the pale, several brothers marrying a single wife was horrible, but also, and this was probably the most important thing and emphasized, it was one of the things that was keeping the Buddhist community from having a healthy growth rate in terms of the number of population. So even today there are very strong campaigns against birth control policies, including any kind of effort to use condoms and so on, to stop the spread of AIDS, which is not much of a problem in Ladakh, but it certainly is in other parts of India. Now, what's striking about these discussions in the 1920s and 30s, up to the 1960s really, is that the issue of caste discrimination simply doesn't figure at all in these discussions, as far as I've been able to find. The fact that it gets on the table, there are a number of things that are important there. One is the emergence in Ladakh itself of a modern educated elite, which really didn't believe in these kinds of practices anymore. In some cases, people who themselves came from humble backgrounds, educated at some of India's best schools, coming back to Ladakh and taking on political leadership roles, vehemently oppose not so much the caste discrimination practice initially, but the existence of the aristocracy. They go against the domination of the so-called Skujak families, the people with the pure bodies, as they're called. The other very important factor was the Dalai Lama, who in 1976 maybe already, but certainly in 1980 on his second visit, demonstratively played the drum, the daman, in a modern household. And during every visit to Ladakh now, has himself photographed prominently with the musicians who are playing the haranga at his teachings and whenever he travels around. He always speaks out against caste discrimination, and he does it in Tibetan. It's translated in Ladakhi, and he does it every time. I've been present at many of these occasions. Now, although there are these campaigns and there is the support of the Dalai Lama, very little seems to have changed, really. this example of the nun who was refused entry into the nunnery is only a few years old. What is interesting, one of the important reasons why I think there is little progress is there is this context of fear. There is a fear of being outnumbered by Muslims. There is a fear of the Hindu majority among certain people. Certainly there's a fear of the increasing Nepali immigration, even though people need the Nepalis to do all the labor work that they don't want to do anymore. There is a real sense of fear that Ladakhis themselves are going to be a minority in their own area. As part of attempts to stop this decline of Ladakhi society, mobilization of the Buddhist community is really essential. Maintaining some semblance of unity is seen as essential. And there are divisions, and I won't go into those now, but talking to people about this issue of caste discrimination last summer, one of the things that people said was that nobody really wants to bring it up as very forcefully right now, because even though we political leaders or we, well-educated Buddhist monks know very well that these things are, against the teachings and outdated and they should stop, the villagers take them very seriously. So if we raise these issues in a strong way, we will lose the support of the villagers when we need it, because we want them to come and demonstrate, or we want them to boycott their Muslim colleagues. Now, there are signs of hope. As I said, there is a younger generation, most of whom almost study outside of Ladakh for many years, pursuing university degrees. And while they are away from home, many of these traditional class differences and caste differences don't play such a major role anymore. And I think with time, these things will decline. Also, the LBA, the Ladakh Buddhist Association, and the organizations of low-caste people organize seminars and put on radio programs and so on to discuss these kinds of issues, and in that way trying to raise awareness about them. That in itself isn't going to change too much, but it is important that these things are now on the agenda and can be discussed. Last spring, there was a seminar to which I also was invited to come and see what was going on, which was organized by one of the Lakshespa organizations. And the official theme of the meeting, which was a whole day seminar with all the main sort of Buddhist intellectuals, the monks and lay people, the official theme was compatibility of science and Buddhism, which also in Ladakh has become a big topic. In the West is also very popular, my new research project. But the real agenda was, of course, to talk about caste discrimination. And one of the arguments that was made there, everybody who came up, all the people who gave a speech, were making this point that this was against the Buddha's teachings, and there is absolutely no scientific reason to think that these people are polluting. So this idea that science itself disproves these practices, as a sort of a remnant, a superstitious remnant of the past, may also be something that just begins to wear away some of these practices over time. Looking at music, not only musicians, but music, I think, is really interesting in this context, because in the field of music, many of these battles over tradition and modernity are being fought out, not only in about issues who plays, but what kind of music is played. And Laranga, in a way, is interesting also because I only was thinking about this before, is because it isn't really religious music and it isn't really secular music. It's something in between. Back in '94, I was involved in the production of a tape in Ladakh of religious music. They also did a tape with Sishu Lama. It's the same group of people. It was a Beda musician they recorded. But in this tape with religious music, I was asked to speak a text written by Tupsen Paldana, who you also interviewed, on sort of explaining religious music in Ladakh. And I still remember the first line because I had to say so many times to get it sort of straight on set. And it was, there are two kinds of music in Ladakh: religious music and secular music. And then he just goes on to talk about religious music. But what's interesting about the Laranga is that it is always played in these transitions between the ritual, the religious, strictly religious ritual, and the secular world. It is always the transition where the Lama is coming, or we're in a break between two phases in the Cham dances and so on. The instruments themselves are secular, but the music that is played has a very strong ritual significance, about which Katie knows a lot more than I do. But it is interesting that also today you find huge debates about the quality of the music that is being composed and performed now in Ladakh. And because music speaks to people's hearts, it's also something that is very powerful in speaking to people's hearts. You know, Tsishu Lamo, this Beda singer that I mentioned, she's when she sang, everybody cried. And I mean, she had the most amazing voice. But when we recorded her in '94, we had to do it in an abandoned house in the winter without heating. And the reason was simply, this was a woman who had won the highest national award, Indian national award for cultural performing arts. Even so, nobody would give these people who were recording her a space to record her. It had to be done in an abandoned house. And she ended up dying. Well, I'm not sure if she's still alive, actually. No, she died, yeah. She died in misery, basically. She became ill and just got no support from people and just died under terrible circumstances. Anyway, I want to end up on the positive note. That wasn't my plan at all. So, well, let me put it in these terms. Work like the work done by Katie is really important because Ladakhis, in my own work, I've had to write about things that people really would rather not talk about publicly, or Ladakhis say they can't talk about it because they're Ladakhi, but they really want outsiders to come and work on these issues and write about them, because once they are written about, they must be discussed, and they can be discussed, because it wasn't Tashi so-and-so who raised it, but it was this American student who came and studied and wrote this thing. So it's a really important piece of work also in that context. I went on for much longer than I should, sorry.
Thank you very much. The panelists have been assiduously taking notes, but I think at this point, let's open the floor to questions. Some of you may well have comments or questions, and you can direct them to anyone up here except me. So please. Yes.
A question to Katie or a Danish professor. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Martin. Several years ago, a book was published, a very interesting book by a young German woman who was blind and who went to Tibet and found, or had found previously, but went to Tibet to help with the education of young blind children. And the book was astonishing because the fact of the matter was these children were seen as karmic, I guess, I'm not sure what the phrase would be, karmically polluted, if you will, and they were shut away in closets because of some imagined fault of theirs or misbehavior of theirs in a past lifetime. So I'm curious, in the context of the Buddhist discrimination in Ladakh, what kind of rationalization, if any, was offered for this discrimination by the Buddhists against the various individuals who were discriminated against? Was it a karmic explanation or no explanation at all? Just something that they were ashamed of and didn't want to talk about?
I encountered a lot of people who talked about different levels of reincarnation among humans, as well as animals and spirits and deities. And part of that was what had to do a lot with the caste. Some people explained caste by lower reincarnations. I got a sense, although it's definitely hard to prove that women are a lower reincarnation than men in Ladakh as well, and have some form of impurities. And so, yeah, people really did talk a lot about that structure of reincarnation and people being reincarnated as humans at different levels.
I would say, yes, I agree. What's interesting in Ladakh, I met this woman who went to Tibet, the blind woman. She came to Ladakh, I can't remember when it was, but she made a big impression on people there because of the work she'd been doing, and she was trying to start something similar in Ladakh, getting some similar work done, and I'm not sure that materialized. There is a similar kind of sensitivity around people with physical or mental disabilities. They're kept away as well. They're hidden from public. And there is a similar sense, popular belief that this is connected to karmic imprints from previous lives and so on. With people with when people, well, in some cases, when people develop mental issues, in some cases they are then brought under the auspices of an oracle and trained in controlling the hla, the deity that is possessing them. And there's a literature about that, how in some cases people with certain kinds of what looks like episodes of mental instability are sort of integrated into a higher status position actually through training to become oracles, mediums. But with handicapped people, I mean, you basically don't see them. They're really kept away. There's a Canadian woman called Cynthia Hunt who has an NGO called Health Inc., Health Incorporated, who's been doing some fantastic work with primary health care and handicapped children and raising awareness about these kinds of issues. There's a film that was made about her called The Magic Mountain, I think, which won a couple of awards just recently. But she's working in that field, and I haven't done any work on it, so I just know a few things about it. But it's certainly there's a wide range of popular beliefs and practices that just aren't nice, to put it mildly. And they're very hard to get rid of because they are tied to these beliefs about karma, divine interventions, and so on. They're very strong, even though people will say, people will talk only in sort of Western scientific terms normally when you engage them. But I've encountered lots of examples where these kinds of beliefs are still very, very strong. Not only these, but all kinds of beliefs that are important in determining people's actions in politics, for example. Different manner.
Thank you. Other questions? Let me then open it up to the panel if you'd like to ask questions of one another.
I guess I'd like to hear more about the birth control policies in relation to tainted childbirth and a woman that's being tainted, especially in regards to Tibetan tradition of childbirth.
Yeah, I actually know fairly little about it actually, but I can give you names of people that you can talk to.
Great.
Kim Gucho, Harvard PhD, she's doing work now on reproductive health and birthing practices in Ladakh. And Professor Craig's been doing work as well in the TAR and in Nepal. There are all sorts of taboos and considerations of impurity around childbirth. But I simply don't know enough about it to talk about it.
Go ahead. Lorraine.
Actually, it's kind of related to the status of women, but I always thought that Tibetan society being polyandry, that the women had high status, but I guess I'm wrong.
No, well, I mean, usually what outside observers have written about Ladakh is that the status of women is high, and it is compared to most parts of India. There is an account. I think it's Major Gompertz, who traveled to Ladakh in 1928, wrote a book called The Road to Lama Land, and Magic Ladakh was another one of his bestsellers. He was really writing bestsellers. And in one of those books, I think it's him who compares the status of Ladakhi women to those of Yorkshire miners' daughters, like strong women, independence and stuff. The reality is that married women in tax-paying households, sort of, either aristocratic families or sort of the main class of people, have a reasonably large amount of freedom and control over their own affairs. But certainly lower caste women, it's a very different story. And when you look at the position of nuns, again, this is something Kim has written about. Kim Gucho worked in Zanskar, in a nunnery for a very long time. She's written a book about it called Being a Buddhist Nun, where she, among other things, talks about the struggle of nuns to be recognized as actually people that deserve to have time to study and practice Buddhism. Because traditionally what nuns do is serve monks and work on their families' farms. They don't have time to study. So there has been a movement in Ladakh, supported in part by Western Buddhists, but also by Buddhist women from other parts of the Buddhist world, so East Asia, Southeast Asia, to try and raise the standards of Buddhist nuns. And there has been some success, but like I said, this story about these nuns basically making it impossible for this Beta nun to stay in their nunnery, I think is a painful reminder of that. Just because you're a nun doesn't mean you're a very good person.
Other questions, comments? Well, yes, please.
Wonder, are there a lot of Ladakis involved in research about their own culture?
Increasingly, there is something called the Jammu and Kashmir Academy of Art, Culture and Languages, and that the lay branch of that employs a lot of locals, only locals almost. They've concentrated mostly on recording folk songs, folk tales, and writing about history and Buddhist philosophy. There is very little so far critical scholarship in Ladakh on contemporary affairs. It's beginning. Kim Gucho is working with a young gynecologist in this project on birthing practices, and in that context, they're trying to raise also questions about the Buddhist Association's policies against, in terms of reproductive health and against abortion and birth control measures. But for a Ladakhi woman, it's very difficult to raise these kinds of issues. The present gynecologist at the main hospital, her predecessor, was very popular and very famous. Everybody loved her, and she was really competent and very dedicated to working for women's health issues. But when this campaign against birth control measures heated up, she was threatened on her life and had to resign from her job. So it really is very difficult. Wider on politics and development issues, there are some people that have been raising controversial matters. The most prominent of those is a young Ladakhi engineer also, who started an organization called the Students' Educational and Cultural Movement of Ladakh, which became very famous in India. He got an award as he was the man of the year according to one of India's national magazines at some point. Had the support of the state government to reform the entire education system. And his organization was shut down last year by the local administration, also because he had lost all support from politically powerful people in Ladakh after working for 20 years in this field. One reason was that he and his group were advocating using Ladakhi as a written language in a way that was closer to the way in which it was actually spoken. And this raised a lot of resistance from the traditional elite, particularly the monastic elite, but also other intellectuals, because the only proper way to write Ladakhi is in the form of classical Tibetan, which basically would be like saying that don't teach people Italian, teach them Latin, in Italy. It really is like that. They don't understand classical Tibetan. So these kinds of reformers run major risks in the society. So it's a long struggle, but there are lots of people involved in it, and increasingly these younger people are willing to speak up because they realize that if they should survive in India, with 1 billion people around them, they need to have a society that is actually sort of strong and grounded and aware of its strengths rather than defensive and divided along all these lines.
I'd like to ask Katie if you've received quite a lot of encouragement after writing this, that this is something that really, it not only was it original research, but it's original research that turns out to have really been quite important. What are you going to do in the future? Do you have plans to go back there, follow up?
I'm working on 2 articles, trying to break my thesis down and build it up again. It really needs more research to stand on, but I also need to break it up to kind of strengthen the ideas in it. So hopefully one of the publications will be coming out in 2 months.
But aside from actually working with the document, what about your interest in the region or advocacy work? You're now involved in the Smithsonian Institution and helping to plan a presentation of culture of Bhutan at the Folklife Festival. Is that right?
Yep. which actually has interesting crossovers with the identity issues that we discussed today. But I've been talking to a friend in Ladakh about having a cultural center there and archiving more music, and it really serving as like a community center that's based on Ladakhis and their own culture on their own terms, and a model that the Smithsonian really abides by, rather than an NGO imposed by me.
Well, that's the best result of all of this. If you go back, keep going back, if you've sort of found your muse and follow that and keep going back and contributing, because as has been pointed out, it often eases the way for local people when an outsider can come and say things that are difficult for local people to say, and I've found that to be true in Central Asia as well, and it can be the beginning of something. So we applaud your work of the past and hope that in the future you'll find your way back there and continue this impressive and important work. So thank you, and thank you to our panelists for coming, and thank you for coming and sharing this program.